I have a question. If you had 10 days time to do anything that you wanted, what would you do? Would you pick up a new hobby like yoga? Or would you book a holiday somewhere nice, take a break? Or would you use that time to make some improvements around the home, things that need to be done? Or you could invade Belgium.
Zeg makker.
And this is exactly what King William I of the Netherlands did in 1831. When he found that he had 10 free days, he decided to attack the rebellious Belgians who had declared independence from the United Kingdom of the Netherlands the year before. And that is the subject of today's video. Why did the Dutch try to invade Belgium that year? What was the history behind it, and what was the eventual outcome? If the Netherlands had decided to invade Belgium 1,000 years later, it might have looked very different. Now, today's sponsor, Mech Arena, is a great game for testing your skills in advanced mega robot combat. It is fast-paced games where well-balanced teams have to use tactics and skill to blast their way to victory. Mech Arena also just released a new pilots feature, introducing 12 unique pilots, which each add depth of strategy and a variety to your gameplay. You can customize your pilot skills to construct the best operators to fit your personality and playstyle. And of course, you can kit out your mechs to become deadly machines of war. What I like about Mech Arena is the free style of play, as well as the fact that when you send another robot back to the canning factory, it announces noob identified. It's pretty fun. On top of that, there's Battle Pass Season 2, 3 new 2v2 deathmatch maps to fight on, and a packed schedule of holiday events. The cool thing about Mech Arena is that it just launched the new Mechs Are Here event, in which they raised over $100,000 for charity, which is really cool. The game is free to play on Android and iOS right now, and you can use my personal link or scan my QR code to get 50,000 credits, 3 gold crates, and 1 exclusive mech skin heraldic to help kickstart your game. And if you're quick, you can add me to your friends, as seen here, and we can play some matches together. So don't wait around, try out Mech Arena today. In the first part in this series, I talked about the history of the Netherlands and Belgium leading up to the Belgian Revolution, and in the second part of the series, I talked about the Belgian Revolution itself, which is a good one to start with if you haven't watched that. But just to recap, the Belgians rose up in revolt against the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, which modern-day Belgium had been a part of. This was called the Belgian Revolution. And although Dutch soldiers were sent in to try and quell the unrest and the rebels, they were unable to oust them from Brussels, especially as a large part of the Dutch army had gone over to join the Belgians, and so there was a situation of an armed stalemate when 1830 came to a close. On the 21st of July 1831, the Belgians chose Leopold I as the new King of Belgium. Let's just say the Dutch king wasn't pleased.
It's treason, then.
And so decided he would launch what would become known to history as the 10-day campaign, the Tiendaagse Veldtocht against the Belgians. Now we have to understand a little bit about the situation of the Netherlands in 1831 to understand why they decided to attack the newly independent Belgium. Quite a few of the stricter Protestants in the northern Netherlands were actually quite pleased that the south had decided to secede away, because the south was where far and away the most Catholics lived, and now that they were gone, it meant that a kind of Protestant bloc would certainly rise to prominence and could dictate their own terms, and they wouldn't have to fear from the Catholics. The flip side, of course, was that this new northern Netherlands, there were still quite a lot of Catholics, particularly in the southern regions, and they of course were not too pleased about the new balance of power, and so Catholics were more likely to support an attack to bring back the southern provinces into the Netherlands. However, across the board there was the idea that the Dutch army had been humiliated by rebels to the south. The fact that they had been unable to quash this rebellion was seen as a tragedy, a national tragedy that needed to be avenged. However, at the same time, many were unwilling to enlist themselves into the Dutch army to have this done. This was a problem that Willem would need to face, as there were several other problems that were also haunting the Dutch army of early 1831. One of these is that we're not actually sure how large the army was that was sent into Belgium. Some historians put the figure as high as 50,000, whilst others go for a more conservative 36,000 men. There was also the problem that in 1830 the army had really been conscripting far more men from the southern Netherlands than the northern Netherlands. And this actually was one of the reasons for the Belgian revolt, because the people in the southern provinces were unhappy with the way that things were going. But this also meant that when these defected, it left the Dutch army far smaller than it had been, as large parts of the Dutch army were now actively fighting against them. The Dutch would of course have to fill in these numbers, and this they would have to do by calling up volunteers to go and serve with the army if they wanted to attack Belgium. These would be called something like the state militia, which in Dutch are called de schutterij. These had been around since the Dutch Golden Age and were essentially the town guard of various places, sometimes also guilds of shooters who would come together and shoot for fun, but could be relied upon to defend the Dutch Republic as it was then, and now the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, when it came under attack. And as the Dutch saw the Belgian Revolution as an internal revolt, they could be called up to make up the ranks in the army. And this Willem did, and so replenished the numbers in the army. A final part of the Dutch force was made up of armed students from various universities around the Netherlands. These might be described as a kind of student militia. They're called the Studentenweerbaarheid in Dutch, and they were essentially companies of students that banded together and would assist the army, largely as flankers, basically being on the flanks of the army, light troops, which in Dutch are mostly called jagers, the more famous Jäger being the German term. These came especially from various northern university cities such as Amsterdam, Leiden, Utrecht, Franeker and Groningen. Let's also have a quick word about the Belgian forces at this time. The Belgian forces in 1831 numbered around 24,000 and fell into two broadly different camps. Part of this was because obviously Belgium had been a part of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, and as I've just mentioned, there were quite a lot of people that were serving in the army at the time. Several of these units would defect over to the Belgian side, and this would form the core of, let's call it, the Belgian Army. This was split into two different armies. The Meuse army sat along that river, which were, of course, they had been Dutch regular units that then mutinied against their commanders and then came under the command of the new Belgian National Committee. And there was finally also the Scheldt army, which was situated more to the west on the border with the Netherlands. At the same time, there was also the Civic Guard. This was made up of various units spread out in the towns and cities of Belgium. They had come about following the Belgian Revolution in an attempt to keep social unrest at a minimum, as they had driven out Dutch officials, authorities and other troops, and indeed they were able to turn their guns on Dutch soldiers when they had attempted to quash the revolution. These might be compared to the schutterij, which were oftentimes actually the same units, just that the Civic Guard were the ones that were serving on to the south of the Dutch-Belgian border, and they are called in Dutch the Burgerwacht and in French La Garde Civique. The invasion began on the 2nd of August 1831, following a build-up of Dutch troops in the nearby town of Breda. They crossed the Belgian border around Poppel, and there managed to ransack the town in order to gain bread as well as quite a lot of money. The first fights with the Belgians occurred near Rafels, where the Belgian army were defeated and driven into a nearby swamp. The close town of Zondereige was at the same time also attacked. The Belgians in this area retreated to the town of Turnhout to spend the night after having been driven from the border. It's said that Willem, the Prince of Orange, led his own soldiers on the attacks at Rafels, and this greatly heightened the morale of his men, many of whom, as I mentioned, were the Leidse jagers, so those from Leiden, the students who had enlisted to fight. And this was seen as being a great Dutch victory, despite the fact that relatively few casualties had fallen. The next day, on the 3rd of August, Dutch artillery bombarded the Belgian troops in Turnhout, calling many of the inhabitants in the region to flee towards Antwerp, a citadel that could be better defended by Belgian forces. At the same time, Dutch troops made that they were going to move towards the west to attack Antwerpen, but really looped around and attacked Turnhout at the same time as another Dutch division attacked it from the north. The Belgian defenders of the city fled, and the city was captured by the Dutch. On the 4th of August, the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Dutch divisions entered the now abandoned city of Turnhout, occupying it themselves. At this point, the army somewhat split up, with some staying behind to defend the newly conquered Turnhout and others moving further south. Whilst inside the city, they tore down the French flag that was on the market square and triumphantly put up the Dutch flag. But the Prince of Orange actually ordered that they reverse this decision because his father, King William I, was keen not to let it be seen as a kind of Dutch occupation or Dutch takeover, but rather that Dutch order was simply being restored after a period of unrest. The Dutch 2nd Division, under the Count of Saxon-Weimar, marched further towards Geel and Diest, where they fought against Belgian troops, while the 1st Division would leave the following day. The 3rd Division, on the other hand, would continue a march more towards the east to try and liberate the besieged city of Maastricht. Now, the next day, on the 5th of August, the schutterij, so these informal guilds of shooters, especially from the northern Netherlands, from the province of Friesland, the city of Amsterdam, the province of Noord-Holland, and from Den Bosch, came under heavy fire in firefights that lasted from the 5th to the 6th of August around the area of Houthalen, somewhat to the east of Geel and Diest. The Belgian Regular Army, which of course had mutinied against the standard Dutch army during the revolution, this being that section along the Meuse, was trying to attack the Dutch column that was moving towards Maastricht. But the resistance of these schutterij troops was so stark that the Belgians decided to call off the attacks after sustaining significant casualties from the militia. Instead, the Belgian Maasleger decided to retreat in front of Maastricht to try and block the new Dutch column from reaching the besieged city. The Belgians at the time had a force of around 7 battalions of infantry in support of around 6 squadrons of cavalry, and together with 3 batteries of artillery, they made up not an insignificant force. Now, the Dutch army that opposed them at this time was made up of around 14 different battalions of infantry. So in terms of infantry, they far outnumbered the Belgians. And they also had 2 batteries of artillery, however, they had no cavalry. And so the balance of the fight would be particularly interesting, as the Dutch flanks were particularly weak to Belgian cavalry attacks, having none of their own. In order to count this Belgian cavalry threat, the Dutch made their advance through the wooded areas, but unbeknownst to them, the Belgians had created a rather large series of fortifications and redoubts in this area, and so the going was very tough. And sometimes in Dutch this is called het offer van Lanaken, because this was fought in this neighbourhood of Maastricht on the outskirts of the city, and because many Dutch soldiers were killed during that day. However, yet again the schutterij came to the rescue, and they were able to salvage the day for the Dutch troops in bringing significant casualties once again to the Belgians, largely because of their marksmanship practices. And these were again largely those schutterij troops from the north, and there is actually a saying that remains a little rhyme from the period, which said, "De Friezen houden niet van politesse, zij slaan met kolven en steken met messen," which means the Frisians don't like civility, they strike with clubs and stab with knives. So clearly these northern troops of militia were known to fight in quite a dirty way, but this was rather effective during these fights at Lanaken and allowed the Dutch to keep progressing despite the heavy resistance offered by the Belgian troops. The following day, on the 7th of August, the commander of the Belgian Mass Army, Joseph Nicolas Dain, was able to score a sole victory against the Dutch military at the Battle of Kermt, where around 100 casualties fell on either side. But the Dutch advance simply couldn't be stopped, as by the next day, the 8th of August, they were advancing once again and Dain was retreating back away from open battle. However, a battle would indeed come, and this was a battle fought at Hasselt. This time the Dutch were led by the Prince of Orange himself, and 3 divisions were to attack the Belgians from 3 different sides. The Belgians in turn didn't want to commit to another open battle, and so pulled back in the region of Maastricht, although they couldn't pull back any further because of course Maastricht was still garrisoned by Dutch troops at the time. Instead, they decided to leave a few men and several cannon in the town of Hasselt to try and delay the Dutch advance. However, the Dutch were quite soon able to capture Hasselt itself, and then cavalry were sent to overtake the Belgian column retreating from the town, which they subsequently did, at which point a rout started to ensue among the Belgians. While they were eventually able to set up cannon and fire back at the Dutch, at which point the battle ended, around 700 men of the Belgian army had been killed and the army was in total disarray. With the Belgian defeat at Hasselt and Dutch troops coming ever closer to the capital of Brussels, it looked like the game was almost up for Belgium. So, in haste, they quickly sent ambassadors to neighbouring France and begged for help. The French, who didn't want to see Dutch domination next door, decided to raise many troops and prepared to go to the assistance of their new Belgian neighbours. But of course, they would need a few days to get the troops together. In the meantime, on the 10th of August 1831, the Belgian Parliament agreed that French troops would be allowed to enter, as they had to ratify this in the constitution first, but nevertheless, the following day, on the 11th of August, the Belgian troops were defeated in battle by the Dutch at Boutersem. This was the Belgian Army of the Scheldt, the other of the mutinous battalions of the Dutch army that had joined the Belgian Revolution, and the Dutch marched even closer to the capital city. On the 12th, Dutch troops decided to attack the headquarters of Belgian King Leopold at Leueven. The Prince of Orange once again led the attack. They crossed the River Dyle and seized significant heights from the Belgians. Most of the Belgian casualties would fall around the Rooselberg, and the Belgians lost another battle to the advancing Dutch. However, this was to be the last of the armed engagements of the 10-day campaign, as on the horizon around 70,000 French troops could be seen, and the Dutch ordered their soldiers not to engage because, of course, engaging France was a very different story to trying to quash a few Belgian rebels to the south. This was made possible because the traditional allies of the Dutch, the Russians for example, were busy in Poland fighting off the Polish revolt that had broken out there, and so they couldn't be relied upon to help keep the French in check. At the same time, the Prussians wouldn't get involved if the Russians didn't have their eastern flank, and so the Dutch were largely on their own and couldn't really mount an effective resistance if the French did decide to declare war on them. The French therefore came in and saved the Belgians at the last minute. So the Dutch decided not to go to war with the French, and a ceasefire was called for very soon after. Nevertheless, the Dutch princes that had led the Dutch advance into Belgium still entered Leuven. They sat and had a few beers. You know what, times haven't changed that much. Still, a lot of Dutch people go to Belgium just to drink some beer and then go back. And on the 20th of August 1831, the last Dutch troops crossed the border and went back to the Netherlands proper. In the Netherlands today, in Amsterdam, you can still see this monument, the Eendracht, which was erected in honour of the fallen Dutch soldiers that died during the 10-day campaign in Belgium, and made from one of the cannons that was captured at the Battle of Hasselt, where William had been present. Everyone who served in the Dutch army during the 10-day field campaign was given this small cross to commemorate their service, and there are actually quite a few famous Dutchmen who were involved during the campaign and who can be seen wearing this cross. None other than William himself, William II that is, who had become king in 1839, is always depicted wearing that cross on his breast. There is also another. Antonius Matthijssen served as a soldier, a medic to be precise, during the field campaign, and sometime later in 1851 he would actually invent the first plaster cast that would be used, which are still used today for obviously when you have broken arms and legs and that kind of thing. So what did the 10-day campaign actually do? Because of course Belgium, as we all know, still exists for now. And really that was one of the main aims of the campaign, wasn't it? To take back Belgium. So does that mean that this was an entirely Dutch defeat? Well, in some ways it was a defeat, because Belgium does still exist. They weren't able to reincorporate the southern provinces into the Netherlands, but there is some question about whether that was the entire intention with the 10-day campaign. Of course, the Dutch army ended up being far stronger than perhaps they had imagined. The Belgian army proved to be no match for the advancing Dutchmen. It was only when the French intervened at the last minute that Belgium was saved from being entirely incorporated. But much more than that, for the Dutch themselves, themselves, this was seen as being a kind of revenge for the humiliation the Dutch army and the Dutch people as a whole, for those that believed it, had befallen during the Belgian Revolution. And so they felt that they had honoured their obligation for revenge in that sense. At the same time, the United Kingdom of the Netherlands had looked like this before the Belgian Revolution. But the Belgians had actually, in the revolution, taken over a far larger piece of land than today we recognise as Belgium, extending further to the north than today, and also taking parts of what today are the southern Netherlands and indeed Luxembourg. Because of the Dutch success during the 10-day campaign in the later peace negotiations that were carried out to determine what Belgium and the Netherlands would look like in the future, because of their conquests, they were able to take back certain parts that had been theirs. This includes Zeeuws-Vlaanderen, which is the part that is just below the islands of Zeeland. That had been contested by the Belgians, but thanks to the Dutch campaigns, this would later be given back to the Netherlands. Furthermore, there was the region around Venlo, where the Belgians had also been involved during the revolution, and indeed the entire province of what is now Maastricht was actually made a duchy. This had also been a region that had seen fighting during the Belgian Revolution, and indeed where a lot of fighting had happened during the 10-day campaign, and this of course today is a part of the Netherlands. And there was also the situation of the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. And while part of the western lands of Luxembourg are indeed today part of Belgium, Luxembourg proper was made a sort of semi-independent duchy that was divided between the Netherlands and Prussia, but which would eventually also become independent. So really a lot of land that had initially been lost was reclaimed because of the Dutch military engagements during the 10-day campaign. The borders would be ratified in the 1839 Treaty of London, which again involved the major powers, and likely would not have gone so much in the favour of the Netherlands if they hadn't engaged in this campaign. There were further alterations made in 1843, the Treaty of Maastricht, which essentially granted yet more land back to the Dutch, but also gave another bit back to the Belgians, particularly around the Duchy of Limburg, today the Dutch province of Limburg. And in 1854, actually, I think when Leopold III of Belgium was on the throne, he actually planned to invade the Netherlands. So there could have been a Belgian invasion of the Netherlands in 1854, although I believe this was more connected to colonial possessions and Belgium wanting to extend out. Obviously, that's one of the Leopolds that did things in the Congo, which we won't speak of here, but that never went ahead because the French emperor at the time said that's a terrible idea, don't do that. But if you'd like a video on that specifically, let me know in the comments below. But anyway, Belgium today, certainly it exists. It's a great place. I really like Belgium. It's been a great joy to visit it, and I have a lot of friends and people in Belgium that I like a lot. But if history had been somewhat different, then perhaps I would be saying people from the southern Netherlands that I like a lot and going on holiday there. Because, well, the 10-day field campaign, it happened, and it wasn't an entirely successful mission in terms of what Willem had wanted, but certainly it has shaped the modern day borders between the Netherlands and Belgium today, for better or worse. And of course, in 1944, the Netherlands and Belgium got an even closer working relationship together with Luxembourg as they formed the Benelux Economic Union. They were also founding members of NATO, which they work in together, as well as the EU, the European Union. And so today, the Netherlands and Belgium do a lot of things together, and there is a very good working relationship. There are tens of thousands of Belgians living in the Netherlands, and I believe over 100,000 Dutchmen living in Belgium at the time. And so, while it may seem unthinkable that we would ever fight a war against each other now, indeed, I think the Dutch would have just as much trouble trying to get across Belgium with their infrastructure as they potentially did in 1831. That was indeed the reality around 180 or 90 years ago. But that is it for now. I hope you've enjoyed this 3-part series about the Belgian Revolution, Belgium and the Netherlands, and indeed about the Tiendaagse Veldtocht, the 10-day field campaign when the Dutch invaded Belgium. Do let me know if you'd like to see more in this kind of vein. I could potentially do a bonus episode either on looking at what if the Belgians had decided to invade the Netherlands in 1854 and some of the history around why they wanted to do that, but also because actually in 1832 the Dutch had held on to Antwerp, which was on the Scheldt, not very far from the Dutch border, but they were besieged there by the Belgians and by the French, and that eventually they had to be blasted out of Antwerpen with, of course, Jan van Speyk, who is a rather famous name in the Netherlands, and that is why it is today a part of Belgium. If you'd like to see that, let me know in the comments below. Please share the series around for people who you think might be interested, because that seriously helps me out, and check out Mech Arena, because once again that makes it possible for me to sit down and literally blab for half an hour about the Belgians, the Dutch and all of that. So for one final time, this has been